I want to proceed with two guests here. Unexpected questions from Dino. Do I pronounce your name correct, Dino? Yes. Egbert, will you unmute Dino?
ויתחבך האדם ואשתו מפני השם אלוקים בתוך עץ הגן. So the Torah uses this expression by saying that Adam hid in the midst of the tree, instead of saying simply in the midst of the garden. So it's just unusual when I hear it in the midst of the tree. How can one hide in the midst of a tree? Why does it not simply say in the midst of the garden?
At this juncture, Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, had eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The tree is very important here. Now, what does that even mean? We're going to leave that alone. Somehow, their knowledge of good and evil, which came from the tree that's in the midst of the garden, you're already getting the answer, caused them to become ashamed of their nudity. And in fact, in the very next verse, it's amazing. If you want to ask the question, you can ask the bigger question next verse, but I don't want to complicate it. When Hashem called out to Adam and he said, "Where are you?" And then Hashem says in the next verse that in fact I hid myself because I'm naked. It means Hashem is saying, why does nudity cause you to hide? So nudity is huge here. It's so big. So I'm going to give you a short answer. The tree is very important here. There's going to be also another tree, which is huge, which is about to come up, which is the tree that's in the middle of the garden. Because we're actually told where the tree is that's in the middle of the garden. And believe it or not, it's not the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but it's the tree of life. We're actually told in the earlier chapter that the tree of life is in the middle of the garden. We really don't know the location of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But we do know the location of the tree of life. So just stay with me here, and we're going to go somewhere really amazing. We are told in Genesis chapter 2 that in the garden was a tree of knowledge of good and evil. And in the middle of the garden is a tree of life. If you notice, God never tells Adam not to eat from the tree of life before the sin. Therefore, it would make no difference to God. That means we're told the exact location of the tree of life. We're not told the location. We just know it's in the garden. We don't know where in the garden. But we do know there's a tree of good and the knowledge of good and evil, and the only tree that is forbidden to eat from is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, why should this be a bad thing? To know the difference between good and evil, that should be a good thing. I'm not going into that now. We have to just avoid that. But what is going to happen in a moment? Prior to the eating from the tree of knowledge and good and evil, there's no warning about staying away from the tree of life. Why? Because death did not enter the world yet. Meaning, if we are told that on the day that you eat from that tree, you will die, which doesn't mean he dies on that day, but it means death enters the world. That means he becomes mortal. So therefore, we can figure out that if Adam had never eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he would have never died. And therefore, eating from the tree of life would have been meaningless. It would have been redundant. Do you understand what I just said? prior to the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it would not have made a difference if Adam ate from the tree of life, because he's anyway was going to live forever. The moment he ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, there's a now, and Adam therefore is condemned, meaning that now there's a termination to his physical life. Now there's an emergency in the middle of the garden. The middle of the garden, there's the tree of life, and that's what, and we're going to see in a little bit later on in the chapter, particularly in Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, Hashem is going to solve this issue, where he's going to call the seraphim, the cherubs, he's going to call them to bring, to block the Garden of Eden so man can eat there. Why not? Lest he eat from the tree of life, and then he will become like a god, meaning he will then have knowledge, but he will live forever. And that has to be blocked. So there's a very interesting thing. The tree of knowledge, the tree of life, which usually gets all the press, I'm going to say that again, I apologize. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is the one that most people are very familiar with. And the tree of life is usually one that it doesn't get that much press, that much attention. So you'll notice that the tree of life we're only told its location. We're not told the location of the tree of knowledge. But Adam is not commanded to stay away from the tree of life. Why? Before he sinned, it wouldn't have made a difference. Once he ate from it, now death entered the world. Mortality entered the world. Now we have to tell you what tree he's near. And it's the tree in the midst of the garden. Bing, bing, alarm, alarm. Tree of life. It's a very good question. Thank you.